Our third speaker today is Rod Dreher. Mr. Dreher is a senior editor at the American Conservative and the author of 5 books, including New York Times bestseller Live Not by Lies, which was published last year, and the Benedict Option from 2017, which incidentally won ISI's Conservative Book of the Year award. He's an Eastern Orthodox Christian who lives in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Rod has been warning Christians, maybe in a kind of Cassandra-like way, perhaps it seems, that there are dark clouds on the horizon. The freedoms we have long taken for granted are being threatened not by external forces, but by ideologies that have taken root here at home. His latest book, Live Not by Lies, offers a warning to contemporary Christians in the West about soft forms of totalitarianism that are emerging. He suggests that there are lessons to be learned from the dissidents who suffered under the hard totalitarianism of communist regimes. The questions we need to ask then are, what are the similarities between these forms of totalitarianisms? What are the differences? And how should faithful Christians meet the moment with clear eyes and courageous hearts? Please join me in welcoming Rod Dreher.
Yeah, so that's going to be my epitaph. I told you so. Thanks for having me. I'm glad you're all... There you have it. Thanks for coming out today, and this is a heavy, heavy topic to talk about, but a really important one to talk about because, as you will have gathered from my colleagues' speeches earlier, we're in a very, very serious moment for American democracy, and I would say something I care about more than democracy, the Christian church. In the spring of 2015, a prominent American physician contacted me after a disturbing conversation with his elderly mother. She's a Czech immigrant who, in her youth, served a jail term as a political prisoner of the communist regime in her homeland. In fact, she had been sent to prison and tortured because she refused government orders to stop attending prayer meetings at her church. Well, the doctor who called me was shaken up and thought somebody needed to know what had happened, what his mother had said. The doctor told me, "My mother says the things going on in this country, America, right now, remind her of what Czechoslovakia was like when communism first came." This doctor had spent his entire life listening to her and his late father, also a Czech immigrant, talking about communism, but never had reason to worry that their stories would apply to America until now. Well, that sounded kind of alarmist to me, frankly. I have an older mom who watches a lot of cable news and gets kind of scared, kind of wound up over the things she sees. But after that conversation with the doctor, when I would travel to conferences or academic events or to give speeches around the country, and I would meet people who had grown up in the Soviet bloc, that is to say, Soviet Union or the captive nations of Eastern Europe, I would tell them what the old Czech woman had said, and I would ask them, "Are you seeing the same things?" Every single one of them said yes. And if you would talk to them long enough, they would complain that whenever they try to warn Americans, nobody believes them. So what are they seeing that frightens them, these people? They are seeing the growing acceptance of an extremely intolerant left-wing ideology that is destroying free thought and free speech in the name of defending victims and achieving social justice. They are seeing people lose their jobs and having their reputations destroyed because they dissent from this ideology. They're seeing academics corrupted by it. They're seeing people lie about what they really believe just to protect their livelihoods. They're seeing children turn on their parents over ideology. They're seeing books banned, or effectively banned, for offending against this ideology. They're seeing ideologically deranged mobs turn on dissidents and hound them both online and in real life. They're seeing outright lies told against those who even dare to question this ideology in an effort to ruin these people. And they're seeing stone-cold fear take control of people who are deathly afraid of being canceled. Could these people be exaggerating the threat? Sure, it's possible. But here's the thing. the more you look at evidence that the United States is stumbling toward a soft form of totalitarianism, the harder it is to dismiss these warnings. So I use the T word here, totalitarianism. Let's define that term. When we think of totalitarianism, what naturally comes to mind is gulags, secret police, torture, and other aspects of communist police states. Well, we don't have any of that here, and we probably won't ever. I hope we don't. So why do I call this soft totalitarianism? Well, strictly speaking, a totalitarian state is one in which a single political ideology and its adherents hold all the political power, and everything in life is made political. Totalitarian states don't just want your obedience, they want your mind and they want your soul. You must learn to love Big Brother. Well, in the 20th century, there were two great English language dystopian novels, George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Because the Soviet Union was like Orwell's fictional police state, and because Orwell was frankly the better writer, it is Orwell who defined totalitarianism for us. Orwell imagined a totalitarian state in which a Big Brother enforced conformity by inflicting pain and terror. Now that's as hard totalitarianism can get. By contrast, Aldous Huxley imagined a totalitarian state in which the world controllers managed conformity by keeping everybody entertained and everybody jacked up on drugs, on porn, and sex. The Huxleyan state wants to eliminate pain, boredom, and unhappiness. Mustafa Mond, the world controller for Europe, calls it Christianity without tears. I contend that in our society today, we are facing not the hard totalitarianism of Orwell, but the soft totalitarianism of Huxley. Here's a true story. When I was in Hungary a couple of years ago interviewing Christian dissidents who had dissented under communism for my book, Live Not by Lies, I had a translator, a young woman who grew up after the fall of communism. She is maybe in her 20s, married for 5 years, I think, at the time, had one child at home and one on the way. We were on the tram going through the city to do one of these other interviews, and she said to me, you know, I'm a Catholic, she said, but I find it so difficult to find people my own age, my friends, to talk to about the struggles I have as a young mom and as a wife. She said, when I start talking to my friends about it, the first thing they say, they cut me off and say, well, we'll just get a divorce, or put your son in daycare and go back to work. You got to be happy. She said, I try to tell them, wait a minute, I love my husband. I love being a mom, but it's difficult sometimes. This is normal life. But they can't understand, she said to me, they can't understand why anybody would choose suffering or struggle. And she says, there's just this barrier between me and people of my generation. I looked at her and said, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. She said, that's it. I'm fighting for my right to be unhappy. Where did you get that? Well, I pulled my phone out and went to chapter 17 of Brave New World, it's online, and read her the confrontation between Mustafa Mond, the world controller, and John the Savage, the dissident. Mustafa Mond says to him, why wouldn't you want to be part of this world we have here? You have everything taken care of. You don't have to worry about anything. And John the Savage says, no, I want poetry. I want beauty. I want sin. I want love. He wants to be human. And Mustafa Mond says, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. He said, okay, I am fighting for that right. Mustafa Mond says, you can have it. Be my guest. Well, we are now seeing in this culture a generation of Americans willing to see religious liberty, free speech, and other important political freedoms taken from us for the sake of creating a safe, tightly managed society where nobody has to feel anxious or sad or offended. A college professor once told me that he gave up teaching Brave New World to his students because almost none of them considered it to be a dystopia. They all thought Huxley's soft totalitarianism sounded like paradise. Well, there are other signs that the United States is ripe for totalitarianism. In 1951, the political philosopher Hannah Arendt published The Origins of Totalitarianism, a detailed study of why in the 20th century Germany and Russia had succumbed to fascism and to communism. Though the two totalitarian systems were at opposite ends of the ideological poles, both of them emerged from similar social and political conditions. Hannah Arendt found conditions that are strikingly present in America today. Among them, and this is the most important, loneliness and social atomization. Totalitarian movements, said Arendt, are, quote, mass organizations of atomized, isolated individuals. What prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world, she continued, is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our century. Now, she wrote these words in the early 1950s, now considered to be, in these bowling alone decades, to have been a golden age of communal solidarity. In January 2020, before the long COVID-19 emergency, the health insurer Cigna released results of a survey finding that 61% of Americans consider themselves to be lonely. Young Americans are far lonelier than the old. 7 in 10 millennials call themselves lonely, with nearly 8 in 10, 79% of Gen Zers, your generation, self-diagnosing as such. 79% calling themselves lonely. A second aspect of a pre-totalitarian society is the loss of faith in hierarchies and institutions. Loneliness is politically significant because it leaves the masses hungry for a sense of community and communal solidarity. In a healthy society, an individual could find fellowship and common purpose through the institutions of civil society, political parties, churches, civic clubs, sports leagues, things like that Edmund Burke called the little platoons of society. But Americans have been dropping out of mediating institutions steadily since the 1960s. Meanwhile, trust in basic institutions, political institutions, the media, churches, law, medicine, and so forth, trust is at dramatic lows. Young adults under 40 are the most religiously unaffiliated generation in American history. And though strongly liberal and democratic in their political preferences, they're also the least likely to embrace a political party. Well, in Europe of the 1920s, said Hannah Arendt, the first indication of the coming totalitarianism was the failure of established political parties to attract new members from the young, and the willingness of the passive masses to consider radical alternatives to the discredited establishment parties. Socialism is still fairly outre among Generation X and older Americans, but those who came of age after the Cold War filled much more warmly towards the radical left. Another fact we're seeing today, another factor of a pre-totalitarian society, is embracing transgressiveness. In both pre-Bolshevik Russia and pre-Nazi Germany, elites reveled in acts of rebellion that made fun of traditions and standards, moral and otherwise. They immersed themselves in baseness and called it liberation. They also took pleasure in overturning institutions and established practices for the sake of benefiting outsiders. This is Hannah Arendt. The members of the elite did not object at all to paying a price, the destruction of civilization, for the fun of seeing how those who had been excluded unjustly in the past forced their way into it. Well, Hannah Arendt's words apply with eerie prescience to the upheaval on today's university campuses, within the media, and within elite culture in general, and spreading out to the mass culture. Another factor of pre-totalitarian society is susceptibility to propaganda and ideology. Whether out of cynicism or misplaced idealism, the willingness to surrender one's moral responsibility to be honest for the sake of embracing a politically useful narrative, that opened the door to totalitarian tyranny. In pre-totalitarian nations, wrote Hannah Arendt, hating respectable society was so narcotic that elites were willing to accept, quote, monstrous forgeries in historiography, unquote, for the sake of striking back at those who, in their view, had excluded the underprivileged and the oppressed from the memory of mankind. Well, you have to think back to the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 Project, which declares that the United States was founded for the purpose of defending slavery. Not that slavery came along with historically in America, and this was a flaw that needed to be remedied. 1619 Project claimed this country was founded precisely to defend slavery. Despite heavy criticism, even from historians of the left, the 1619 Project has been adapted for thousands of classrooms and optioned by Oprah Winfrey and Lionsgate Studios for television and film projects. This is going to be the story of America that a new generation of students will be receiving. But it's only fair to recognize that on the political right, and I'm a conservative, we have a similar problem. QAnon was a mass conspiracy, and plenty of MAGA supporters were willing to believe anything that felt right to them. I talk to conservative Christians these days who tell me that they're having to pull their own parents out of these deep epistemic holes. We've become a country in which millions of people on both the left and the right are willing only to believe things that fit their prejudices. So why were so many people in the 20th century willing to believe ideological lies? Because totalitarian ideology is a political religion that provided meaning, purpose, and solidarity for masses of people who had been alienated from their traditional sources. As traditional Christianity declined, these political pseudo-religions filled that God-shaped hole in the body politic. The Russian-American historian Yuri Slezkin characterizes Bolshevism, that is Soviet communism, as an apocalyptic millennial political cult. It divided the world crudely into the damned, which are capitalists, the middle classes, and the elect, the proletariat and the peasants, and promised that after violently suppressing the forces of evil, the enlightened Leninist would establish an earthly utopia of perfect social justice. Well, it is impossible to miss the parallels between the Bolsheviks and our so-called social justice warriors. In fact, I believe that wokeness is arguably better understood as a form of secular left-wing religion rather than as merely a social or political movement. In a powerful essay that came out in 2018, James Lindsay and Mike Nana detailed the religious aspects of the broad social justice movement. They contend that the social justice movement fulfills the same psychological and social needs that religion once filled, but no longer does for many people. Social justice warriors are members of what Lindsay calls, quote, an ideologically motivated moral community. They hold axiomatic beliefs, dogmatic beliefs that cannot be questioned, only accepted. Those beliefs give meaning and direction in their lives and provide a sense of shared mission. And those beliefs also help them identify who the enemy is, who the bad people are who need to be crushed. So what are those beliefs? A rough catechism based on Lindsay and Nana's analysis goes something like this. 1, the central fact of human existence is power and how it is used. Everything in life is understood through relationships of power. Social justice is the mission of reordering society to create more equitable power relationships. Those who resist social justice are practicing hate and cannot be reasoned with or in any way tolerated, only conquered. 2, there is no such thing as objective truth, there is only power. Religious claims, philosophical arguments, political theories, all of these to the social justice mindset are veils concealing the will to power. They're only rationalizations for oppressors to hold power over the oppressed. The value of truth claims depends on who is making them, on the identity of those making them. 3rd, identity politics sorts oppressed from oppressors. In the cult of social justice, the oppressors are generally white, male, heterosexual, and Christian, though as Professor Mitchell said in his speech, it's not going to stay there. There always has to be oppressors. The oppressed right now are racial minorities, women, sexual minorities, and some religious minorities. Justice is not a matter of working out what is rightly due to an individual per se, but rather what is due to an individual as the bearer of a group identity. This is why, to those guided by critical race theory, a black lesbian who teaches at Harvard is oppressed, while a white man who lives in a beat-up trailer in West Virginia and works as a garage mechanic is an oppressor. We've seen something like this before. In 1918, in the Soviet Union, Lenin unleashed the Red Terror, a campaign of annihilation against those who resisted Bolshevik power. Martin Latsis, the head of the secret police in Ukraine, instructed his agents as follows. This is a quote. "Do not look in the file of incriminating evidence to see whether or not the accused rose up against the Soviets with arms or words. Ask him instead to which class he belongs. What is his background, his education, his profession? These are the questions that will determine the fate of the accused, and that is the meaning and essence of the Red Terror," unquote. In other words, don't ask what people actually did that is counter-revolutionary. Just find out what their identity is and punish them with death or imprisonment on that basis. One was presumed guilty based entirely on one's class and social status. Communists justified the imprisonment, the ruin, and even the execution of people who stood in the way of progress as necessary to achieve historical justice over alleged exploiters of privilege. A softer, bloodless form of the same logic is at work in American institutions today. Social justice progressives advance their malignant concept of justice in part by terrorizing dissenters as thoroughly as any inquisitor on the hunt for enemies of religious orthodoxy. Here's another aspect of the cult of social justice. Intersectionality is social justice ecumenism. All of those oppressed by the privileged classes, the patriarchy, whiteness, and so forth, are connected by virtue of their oppression and should challenge power as a united front. If one is not a member of the oppressed group, then he or she can purify themselves by becoming an ally in the power struggle. And finally, they believe that language creates human realities. Social justice warriors believe that human nature is constructed largely through the use of linguistic conventions. This is why they focus so heavily on what they call discourses, that is, the style and the content of modes of speaking that, in their view, legitimize certain ways of being and delegitimize others. Woke enforcers tightly police the spoken and the written word, condemning speech that offends them as a form of violence. This is why in New York City, that progressive utopia, you could be fined thousands of dollars, you really can, for using the wrong pronoun to address someone. Well, look, nobody expects the return of Stalinism with its state monopolies, its crackpot economics, and its Gulag archipelago. But the outmoded idea that totalitarianism requires an Orwell-style terror state is a big reason why so many of us Americans today are blind to the softer form of totalitarianism now taking shape. In fact, the Cold War concept that big business is the enemy of the statist Leviathan conceals the leading role that capitalism in our time plays in this malign transformation of society. I have to say that myself, I was born in 1967 and came of age politically during the Reagan years at the end of the Cold War, and I myself was slow to understand the role that big business plays in driving social change, because it just didn't come, I was socialized to think otherwise. But today, an elite club of global mega corporations are more powerful than many countries. Walmart has more annual revenue than the nation of Spain, and more than twice as much as Russia. ExxonMobil is bigger in terms of revenue than India, Norway, or Turkey. As the international strategist Parag Khanna says, in a world where Apple has more cash on hand than 2/3 of the world's nations, corporations are likely to overtake all states in terms of clout. And in an America that now runs on the internet, 5 companies, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, have an almost incalculable influence over public and private life. At the same time, big business has moved steadily leftward on social issues. Standard business practice long required staying out of controversial issues on the grounds that taking sides in the culture war would be bad for business. That all changed in a very big way in 2015 when the firepower major corporations brought to the Indiana gay rights versus religious liberty fight turned it into a Waterloo for religious and social conservatives. Today, corporations regard taking progressive stands on social justice issues like race and gay rights as a critical part of their branding. Polls show that millennials and Generation Z customers are especially prone to seeing their consumer expenditures as part of creating a socially conscious personal brand identity. For many companies, then, signaling progressive virtues to consumers is a smart business move in the same way that signaling all American patriotism would have been to corporations in the 1950s. But what counts as a positive contribution to society? For today's capitalists, the answers are always on the progressive left. Woke capitalist branding harnesses the unmatched propaganda resources of the advertising industry to send the message, both explicitly and implicitly, that the beliefs of social and religious conservatives, and even some fundamental beliefs of the classical liberal tradition, are obstacles to the common good. What's more, with the emergence of what the former Harvard business professor Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, the capabilities of major corporations to mine intimate details from the data individuals create on the internet by using smartphones and other smart devices gives to big business immense power over the future of democracy. Most Americans are unaware that we're all being monitored by corporations in ways in which the KGB could only have dreamed. Consumer convenience is how Americans are learning to love Big Brother. We don't have to search the pages of dystopian literature for an example of how a future totalitarianism would likely work in America. We only have to look to China, where the communist state is using the reach and power of the internet and artificial intelligence to build what they call a social credit system to force citizens to conform. By using the all-seeing electronic eye to regulate personal status and individual liberties, as well as access to consumer goods and services and employment, China is pioneering a modern form of soft totalitarianism. As the Chinese society becomes cash-free, and it is probably the most cash-free society on earth now, they hope to be completely cashless, the Chinese state will have the power to make it impossible for ordinary people to buy or sell if they do not bow down before the Communist Party. Think about that. You can't buy or sell if the government doesn't want you to. This is apocalyptic. Now, we have most of that same technology right here in the United States, but we do not yet have the political impetus to use it. But if enough Americans become convinced that our safety and comfort would be better served by regulating and suppressing dissent, then we will get a social credit system here. Just last year, a reader of my blog who works in engineering sent me a paper from a trade journal that tracks coming trends. The paper said that, quote, "The market for social credit system infrastructure will ultimately become a mainstream component of both business and public policy," unquote. That is to say, American big business and American big government are preparing themselves for the social credit system right now. This is not paranoia, this is happening. So how do we build a resistance? If emigres from the Soviet bloc are warning us about the rising tide of totalitarianism, then those who remained under communism and resisted it can advise us on how to fight back now and in the future. In talking to former anti-communist dissidents, all Christians still living in Russia and Eastern Europe, I learned that they are afraid too of what they sense is coming, and coming for them as well, but also mystified about the forms it is taking. Over and over, I heard the same thing. At least under communism, the lines between good and evil were clear. One Slovak priest said that under communism, the gospel shone a light straight through the darkness, but now the light of the gospel only hits fog. So they're trying to figure it out too. Nevertheless, there are some clear lessons that we can learn from their experience and apply today. First, we have to commit ourselves to living in truth. We have to commit ourselves to living in truth. Live not by lies, said Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his final communique to the Russian people before the Soviets forced him into exile in 1974. Even politically powerless people, he explained, could refuse to say, to write, to affirm, or to distribute anything that distorts the truth. They could refuse to attend a demonstration or sign on for a cause unless they truly believe in it. And they will not take part in a meeting in which people are not allowed to speak the truth. So today, here in America, if somebody tells you that you have to prove your good faith, you have to prove you're not a racist or a sexist or a bigot by signing this or publicly agreeing to that, even though you don't really believe in it, then you have a moral obligation to refuse it. Your own integrity is on the line. Second, with that comes the fact that we have to accept the burden of suffering for the truth. This is how we show what we're made of. This is how we show what we really believe in. The new soft totalitarianism is taking hold among people, especially among the younger generation, who are terrified by discomfort, much less suffering. They're unnerved when confronted by thoughts or expressions that upset them. They would rather have not Big Brother, but Big Mama and Big Daddy shut down all freedom of speech and expression to protect them from having to suffer the knowledge that somewhere, somebody has a challenging opinion. So how are people who can't even bear disagreement going to find it within themselves to withstand real and tangible suffering for the sake of the truth? They can't, and they won't. In fact, they will happily impose that suffering themselves on others to create a so-called safe space. And they might succeed because in this world, you often see people, older people, who are in charge of institutions who are eager to throw dissenters to the wolves in order to appease the progressive mob and to gain that sense of purity that they're so desperate for and of absolution. You have to be ready to resist them no matter what it costs you. The Czech dissident Václav Havel, who was put in prison for his dissident activities and later became the first president of a free Czechoslovakia, he created the parable of a greengrocer who refuses to hang a sign in his window saying, "Workers of the world unite." That's the Marxist slogan. Havel said, imagine that everybody in the city has to put that sign in the window, whether they believe it or not, just to avoid trouble. Well, because he refuses to hang that in the window, that sign in the window, this gets him in trouble. The government agents come around, they take his business away from him, he loses privileges and status, his kids can't go to the best colleges, he can't travel, and his family becomes a pariah. But the greengrocer has won a great moral victory. By being willing to take that suffering for the truth, he's shown that it is possible to live in truth, to take a stand for your convictions, and to refuse to conform. And this can, over time, destabilize tyranny. Havel wrote, "He has shown everyone that it is possible to live within the truth. Living within the lie can constitute the system only if it is universal. The principle must embrace and permeate everything." Solzhenitsyn came to the same conclusion. So when I talk to these dissidents today, the people who lived through that, the Christians who lived through that, the dissidents told me that suffering is more bearable when it is rooted in firm religious conviction or some other transcendent ideal. We American Christians have got to get rid of this weak, watery, Jesus is my best friend style of Christianity. We have to rediscover the hard faith of the martyrs and the confessors of our time and of all times. A faith that is strong enough to endure suffering as the cost of discipleship. Nothing else will get us through what's to come. Nothing else will get us through what's to come. Alexander Ogorodnikov, a Russian Orthodox Christian and prominent Brezhnev-era dissident whose face bears evidence of his torture in prison, is partly paralyzed from his beatings. He told me that suffering people need, quote, "a golden dream, something to live for, a conception of hope." You can't simply be against everything bad. You have to be for something good, he said. Otherwise, you can get really dark and crazy. Third, we have to build solidarity within small groups. A couple of years ago, I was in Bratislava, capital of Slovakia, in a cramped, hidden chamber under a house, accessible only by a tunnel under the basement. The historian Jan Somulchek told me how the underground Slovak church produced samizdat there. Samizdat was illegal publications under communism. Well, as a college student in the 1980s in Bratislava, Jan Samulchik was part of a secret underground church cell that distributed illegal gospels, prayer books, and things like that that were printed in that secret room. He told me that he learned how to be free in the fellowship of the young men in his Catholic circle there. He said, only in small communities could people feel free under communism. He said, in devotion to each other and to the causes of faith in Jesus Christ and freedom for his nation, those young men gradually overcame their fear of totalitarianism. Samulchik said, we helped one another to gradually build up the courage to do bigger things, like go out onto the square in Bratislava in 1988 in the first public demonstration since the Soviet invasion in 1968. The underground church called the people to come stand in the square with candles and just pray and sing hymns to demonstrate against the government. The government was caught off guard. They sent in water cannons to disperse the people. You can see it all on YouTube. But this so-called candlelight demonstration, the candle demonstration, was the thing that kicked off the Velvet Revolution that overturned communism. But the courage started 20 years earlier with these young people coming together to form these small groups and to work together, to pray together, and to learn how to be free together. Zofia Romaszewska, a former organizer with the Polish trade union Solidarity, told me, as I see it, this is the core. This is the essence of everything right now, forming these communities and networks of communities. Whatever kinds of communities you can imagine, she said, the point is that the members of that community must be very supportive of one another no matter what comes. Third, in the face of soft totalitarianism, would-be dissidents should cultivate cultural memory. That is, they should immerse themselves, we should immerse ourselves, our families, and our small groups in the study of our history, of our art, of our literature and religion, and of all things that make our culture distinct. Totalitarian movements always seek to erase a people's history and culture from collective memory because it makes people easier to manipulate. Do not let them do this. In an interview with me a few months before his death in 2019 from cancer, Sir Roger Scruton reflected on the key role that private seminars held in dissidents' home under communism played in keeping cultural memory alive in the face of communist annihilation. These meetings were not merely casual lectures by scholars to keep audiences entertained amid the tedium of totalitarianism. These were actually a means of cultural survival. In the 1980s, prominent Western academics like Charles Taylor, Jacques Derrida, and Roger Scruton worked with Czech dissidents to build an underground university system in which true scholarship, not ideological claptrap, was possible. In an interview not long before his death in 2019, Sir Roger, who was once detained by the Czech secret police, told me that when he and his British colleagues first visited Czechoslovakia in the late 1970s, they were astonished to discover that Czechs were determined to cling to their cultural inheritance because they thought that it contained the truth, not just about their history, but the truth about their soul, about what they fundamentally are. Sir Roger told me, quote, that was the thing that the communists couldn't take away. Well, this is something that we are losing now in our time and place, and not just because of woke schools and universities. This teacher of the English language in Budapest, a man named Tamás Shai, told me from my book that generations that came of age after the fall of communism have fallen into the abyss of Western-style hedonism and consumerism. He said to me, what neither Nazism or communism could do, victorious liberal capitalism has done. It's cut these people off, the children off from their history. And this man is a capitalist. He hates communism, but he has the honesty to recognize that if we don't fight back against this sort of thing, we're going to lose it, even though totalitarians are not necessarily taking it away from us. Finally, a lesson that runs through the testimonies of many of the dissidents that I talked to, in stark warning to us Western democracies. It can happen in your country too. There's always this fallacious belief. It would not be the same here. Here, such things are impossible, wrote Alexander Solzhenitsyn in a foreword to a later edition of the Gulag Archipelago. Alas, said Solzhenitsyn, All the evil of the 20th century is possible everywhere on earth. I think a lot of people think that this stuff is alarmist and laugh at these people who came out of communism because they think that's something for Russia. It couldn't happen here. Well, it can happen here, and it will happen here if we don't stand against it. In my book, Live Not by Lies, I tell the story of a conversation I had with a 26-year-old California woman who told me that she considered herself to be a communist because she loves the dream of universal brotherhood and equality. So I asked her, what about the gulags? She had no idea what I was talking about, none. Now, this young woman is university educated, but she was born after the end of the Cold War. Nobody in her family, nobody in her schooling, nobody in this culture had ever explained to her what communism really was. Well, last night at dinner, Professor Dan Mahoney told a story about a colleague at another university who told her students that for extra credit they could watch a video lecture that Professor Mahoney gave on Solzhenitsyn at Hillsdale. All of these students were favorably disposed to Marxism. So they watched Professor Mahoney's lecture, and afterwards they told their teacher that what Dan Mahoney and Alexander Solzhenitsyn said about the Gulag Archipelago could not be true, because if it was true, they surely would have heard of it by now. That kind of historical ignorance and moral arrogance is going to destroy this country if we don't fight back. Most of the great Russian and European anti-communists, Solzhenitsyn, Havel, Czesław Miłosz from Poland, Karol Wojtyła from Poland, they're dead, and the generations that lived under Soviet totalitarianism are very quickly passing into history. Our news and entertainment media here in America have largely erased their stories and canceled their voices from neglect. But some of these people are still alive, and they want all of us here to know, and to know urgently, that something wicked this way comes. They can feel it in their bones. A Soviet-born university professor in the Midwest told me, quote, "You will not be able to predict what will be held against you tomorrow." She's grieved by the sight of her Midwestern students, she called them good kids raised in the cornfields, who openly profess socialism and embrace, in the name of social justice, a culture that severely punishes heterodoxy and silences dissent. This is what her parents escaped, and now it's here. "You have no idea," she said, "what completely normal thing you do today or say today will be used tomorrow to destroy you," she tells me. "This is what people in the Soviet Union saw. We know how this works." That they do, and they're warning all of us today. Do we have ears to listen? I want to close today by telling you that I dedicated my book, Live Not by Lies, to a man named Father Tomislav Kolakovic. Father Kolakovic was a Croatian Catholic priest who in 1943 was in Zagreb in Croatia doing work against the Nazis. But he got a tip that the Gestapo was coming for him, so he sneaked out of the country, went to Slovakia, his mother's homeland, adopted her last name, Kolakovic, and began teaching in a Catholic university there. The first thing he did was tell his students, the good news is the Germans are going to lose this war. The bad news is the Soviets are going to be ruling this country when it's over, and they're going to come after the church and Christians. We have to be ready for them. And he knew this because he had studied when he was in seminary to be a missionary to the Soviet Union. So he knew how the Soviet mind worked, the communist mind worked. And he knew that the first thing they would do is come after priests and churches, because on the theory that if you shut down, if you cut off the head of the snake, so to speak, you can kill the body. If you shut down churches and throw the priest in prison, the church will die. So what Father Kolakovic did was he got together groups of young people for prayer, and not just prayer, but to study. They would look about them at what was happening in their society and talk about it in light of the principles of the gospel and of Catholic social teaching. And they would ask themselves, what should we do? How do we get ready for this? Then they would go out, after deciding on something, they would go out and do it. Within 2 years, by 1945, every village of any size in Slovakia had one of these prayer groups. And the bishops, the Catholic bishops of Slovakia, chastised Father Kolakovic. They said, "Father, you're scaring people. You're being an alarmist. It will never happen here." But Kolakovic didn't listen. He knew what was coming, and he knew the only way the church would survive is if the laity were educated and knew their faith and were prepared to suffer for the sake of keeping the church alive. Well, sure enough, 1948, Iron Curtain falls. The first thing the communists did was come after the church. The reason that the underground church survived in Slovakia was Father Kolakovic and those young people who were his early followers organized themselves and prepared themselves to suffer for the sake of the gospel and to keep preaching the gospel. The underground church became the only form of resistance in Slovakia for the next 40 years. And as I said earlier, they were the ones who called the first demonstration that eventually overturned communism. We, young people, are living in a Kolakovic moment right now here in America. We have to use our freedom to prepare ourselves spiritually and otherwise for resistance and for resilience. Thank you very much.
No? Oh, thank you, Rod. I see we have some questions. At least one.
Hi, I'm Jesse Merriam, an associate professor at Patrick Henry College. I wanted to share one anecdote and lead into a question.
Could you talk a little louder,
Oh,
please?
sorry about that.
That's all right.
My wife was raised in communist-controlled Bulgaria, and her dream was to come to the United States, and she was educated at NYU, went to law school at Georgetown, and what she tells me on a nightly basis is precisely what you have just shared, that the suppression of speech and orthodoxy that she's encountered in the United States is much more intrusive and pervasive than even existed under the Soviets. And she's really perplexed because her entire life she was told that the way out was through American-style liberalism. And what she's discovering here is that it's even worse. And the big problem that she finds, and I agree with, is that at least when it was America as the beacon of hope, there was an exemplar, there was a model. But now that Americanism and multiculturalism and all of these things have spread throughout Europe, where is there a model? Where is there a way out?
Yeah.
Which is very different from what she encountered as a child.
Yeah, that's a profound question. I don't know that there is a way out. Just yesterday, I was having beers with a friend who lives in this area. He was a source of mine for the book, and in fact, he's watching us today. He came to this country from Czechoslovakia, and he said that his friends back in the Czech Republic, all of them anti-communist, stalwart anti-communists, they now have come to see the West as the greater danger to what they know to be true. And they're starting to look at Russia as a potential protector. That's absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? And I'm not going to recommend Putin's Russia as an alternative, but it is fascinating to see this happen. I heard the same thing in other places when I was traveling in Eastern Europe. People are so confused. They're watching their children who are turned to the West and only looking at the West, and who have no memory of what happened because for whatever reason, a lot of these people didn't share with their children what happened. They're seeing them corrupted by this. I talked in Poland to a couple of Poles who work for the Polish branch of Western multinational companies. These are the best jobs in Poland. And they say that the Cultural Revolution of gender ideology, transgenderism, this is the thing that most freaks them out about what's coming from the West. The phalanx, the Leninist vanguard, are American corporations and Western European corporations. They're being forced to observe Pride Month and things like that in their offices, even though they're Catholics, they're faithful Catholics, they don't believe in this, but they're afraid to say no because how are they going to support their families? I told them, you had better get on top of this right now and get your government to pass laws to protect you because if you give this a foothold, you're done. You're done. So I don't know where we look for other than to Jesus Christ. And we are going. A lot of us, I think, when I talk to people about this, a lot of Americans like to think, well, surely there's some political leader we can turn to who's going to protect us. Surely we can get this. We can fight back that way. I think we should try to fight back politically. But I got to tell you, as a conservative voter, the Republican Party is useless. Useless. I went to Capitol Hill in 2015, 3 months after Obergefell, to give a a talk to a Christian group. And then afterwards, I had a meeting with some top staffers, key Christian staffers for Republicans on both the House and the Senate side. And I said to them, in our meeting, I said, okay, we lost the Obergefell gay marriage ruling, that's over with, but so what are the Republicans planning to do to protect Christian colleges and schools, to protect religious liberty? What kind of legislation? Nothing. I repeated my question, thinking maybe they didn't understand me. One of them said, oh, it's not really on our agenda. That's when I knew that we were sunk. Now, this is before Trump. But a lot of Christians were so happy that Trump came in thinking he would protect us, and he did do some good things. But if Trump had been the best possible philosopher king president, he couldn't have turned back all of this, because this movement is so immense. It has captured all the institutions, the cultural means of production, to use a Marxist term, in this country. So a lot of us, the best hope we have is in Christ, and I don't say that as an abstraction. I say our hope in Christ is that we know that even if things get bad, and they can get very bad indeed, if we are willing to join our suffering to Christ, that the Lord can use it to redeem this place. This was the only hope that a lot of these people had. Most of the people I talked to, the dissidents over there, they never thought they would live to see the end of communism. They dissented, and some of them went to prison for it and were tortured for it because it was the right thing to do, because they knew they were going to have to stand before God one day and account for what they had done. I tell a story in the book about this man, Alexander Ogorodnikov, a late Soviet dissident. He came from a very prominent communist family, and when he became a Christian in his 20s, and this was in the 1970s, they really wanted to make an example of him. So they threw him into death row, even though he didn't have a death sentence. He was there with the hardest criminals in Russia, and he began to witness to them, to evangelize them. Eventually, the Soviets, the jailers, put him in solitary confinement to stop that. Well, Ogorodnikov began to fear that he was losing his faith. He's like, Lord, why did you bring me here? I'm suffering so much. God sent him angels to give him visions, actual visions. And in these visions, he always saw men walking with their hands behind their backs, handcuffed, led by two guards. He was told that these are men who were going to be killed, executed, but these are men who are going to be with Christ forever in paradise, because Ogorodnikov had been there to witness to them. Now, this old man, he's old now. He was telling me this story in the lobby of the Hotel Metropole, luxury hotel in Moscow, and he had tears in his eyes thinking about it. He went on to say, and this is such an important story for all of you to take to heart. He said that they finally moved into a country jail where he was the only prisoner. His guard was an elderly man who had been a prison guard. Now he was a pensioner. They gave him something to do to watch him, Ogorodnikov, overnight. The old guard came to the cell where Ogorodnikov was and started banging on the bars and said, "You have to hear my confession. You have to hear my confession." Ogorodnikov said, "Hey, I'm not a priest, but what do you want to say?" The old man said, "They come at night. They come at night." Well, who comes at night? He told a story, the guard, about back, I guess in the 50s, when a lot of executions were happening, about how he had been present in a clearing in the woods when the KGB brought about 50 to 75 Orthodox priests. They lined them up, one behind the other. They went up to the first one, put a pistol to his head and said, "Do you renounce Christ?" And the priest said, "No." They shot him. His brain splattered onto the priest behind him. Then they went to the priest behind him. "Do you renounce Christ?" Or, "Do you believe in God?" "Yes, I believe in God." Blew his brains out. They went down each one at a time. Every one of those priests died a martyr and refused to deny Christ. This old man who had seen it happen was being driven crazy. The memories of the faces of those men who died, those priests who died for Jesus, were haunting him at night. And Ogorodnikov told me, again, he started to cry telling me this. He said, "I now know why the Lord would not let me see the faces of those condemned men when they were in my vision, because I wouldn't have been able to stand it psychologically." Now, this is just one story I tell in my book, but these stories are all over Europe, and they tell us the kind of courage and the kind of faith we are going to need to face down what's coming. We may not be be shot and executed. I hope to God not. I hope we never get sent to prison for our faith. But we have got to prepare ourselves because, as Solzhenitsyn said, if you had gone back to the 1890s to these nice, thoughtful, liberal intellectuals in Moscow and said, within 30, 40 years, tortures that haven't been seen in Russia since the Middle Ages are going to be used again, nobody would have believed you. Nobody would have believed you. It can happen here. Thus endeth the lecture.
Jacques Ellul, the French sociologist, said in 1963 that educated people are among the most susceptible to propaganda. And so do you agree, and why do you think that is, if so? And also, what can our students learn about, because they're going to leave here, they're going to go and hang around a lot of educated people, right? So what should our students know about dealing in that context?
There's a great book you can read called The Captive Mind by a great Polish dissident named Czesław Miłosz. The name is spelled, write this down, young people, Czesław, Czesław. The last name is Miłosz, spelled Milosz, The Captive Mind. It came out in 1953. Miłosz had been a communist and an intellectual and a diplomat for the communist government before he defected. And he wrote this book to talk about intellectuals that he had left behind in Warsaw and how they came to convince themselves that communism was the way of the future, and the lies that they told to themselves to justify the horrible things that they did and endorsed. That is a very important thing to read, because somebody ought to write this book today, Dan Mahoney, about the captive mind for intellectuals today, how we, our intellectuals, our college professors today and public intellectuals, the lies that they tell themselves to justify the illiberal and cruel things that are going on. I would simply say this, understand that intellectuals are people too. And they lie to themselves as much, if not more, than anybody else. But we have a system now, especially in the media and in academia, in which intellectuals are prized. Miłosz says, if I'm remembering correctly, that one of the reasons intellectuals were drawn to Marxism is because that was a system that gave them the power to rule. It esteemed intellectuals as experts. Well, I think a lot of this wokeness, it fulfills the same function. Every university, though not, I'm betting Patrick Henry College, but every university has a diversity and inclusion department, and they keep adding more and more staff, commissars, effectively, to monitor the minds and the words and the deeds of faculty and students. This is make work for intellectuals. I would say don't be anti-intellectual, because that doesn't get us anywhere either. But just be skeptical of what intellectuals say and do. And I would say also, this, I don't know if this applies here, but it's probably important to say, when I went to an evangelical college back in 2017, around the time my book, The Benedict Option, came out, and I was giving a series of lectures there about that idea. And I gave one lecture about the importance of developing spiritual disciplines. Disciplines are the foundation of discipleship, and why we have to have spiritual disciplines in the Christian life. Well, after it was over, there was Q&A, and a young woman stood up in the back. Sir, I don't understand, she said. I don't understand what you mean about spiritual discipline. Why isn't it enough just to love Jesus with all our hearts the way our parents taught us? And I said, well, we have to love Jesus with all our hearts. That's where it starts. But that love has to be grounded in practice, and not just individual spiritual practices and disciplines, but communities of practice and discipline. Otherwise, when the winds start blowing, it'll blow away. I could tell she had no idea what I was talking about. After that talk, a professor came up to me and said, what that young lady said is how 99% of the students at this conservative evangelical college, how they think, because they've come up in youth group culture that just tells them it's Jesus is my friend, the Christianity is relational, only relational. They come here to this college and they're still living in the bubble where everybody thinks more or less like they do. But then they get out into the world and they're told by people in the world what Christians believe is not nice, it's mean, it's hateful. And they collapse because they have not had any kind of discipline of thought or discipline of practice to gird themselves for this kind of combat in the world. So I would say to you now, by all means, get rid of any kind of sentimental, warm and fuzzy Christianity. It's not that Christianity is a cruel, hard thing at all. It's not. The yoke is easy and the burden is light, but we can't be sentimental about it. The kind of men and women under communism who resisted, the Christians who resisted, and they weren't most Christians. That's one thing I learned too. Most Christians just went along to go along, kept their heads down. But those who resisted were those who were prepared spiritually and otherwise. I tell a story in the book of this man, Dr. Sylvester Krčmery. He was one of the laymen who was a leader of the underground church in Slovakia. And he wrote a memoir in 1996 after the fall of communism called This Saved Us. And it's a very thin memoir about the kind of practices that he and the other Christians did before they went into prison, anticipating this would come, and the way they lived in prison. One of the things that really got to me, he said, I had to resolve never to feel sorry for myself. I could never see myself as a victim, even though he absolutely was a victim. They tortured him, they beat him, he was in prison for 10 years. But he said, I could not let myself feel sorry for myself or I would collapse. Rather, I chose to see everything that happened to me, every bit of persecution, as being something that I was privileged to suffer for the sake of Christ, because our Savior, my Savior, had suffered them too. And he also saw himself as, his words, God's probe. He said, the Lord has put me here in this prison. I want to learn what he wants for me to see, to deepen my own repentance, to serve others, to pray with others, to comfort others. And this is what he did, and this is what got him through that 10 years, and this is what led him, as soon as he got out, to go back out there and to start evangelizing again and organizing again. The memory of Dr. Krčmery and his testimony got me through about a year ago when I was pretty depressed and down about COVID and feeling sorry for myself. We can't have church, I can't go anywhere, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I thought, wait a minute, look what Dr. Krčmery suffered and so many others, and they didn't feel sorry for themselves. How can I feel sorry for myself? And I chose instead to think of what was going on with the COVID lockdown and the other trials that we were put through, soft as they were. I tended to think of that as, this is God telling me, be my probe, see what I have for you to learn through this suffering, how you can be a more faithful Christian, and how you can help others bear up under this suffering.